What is up, YouTube? I'm Devon DaVinci, leader of the Renaissance Crew, and you are watching DaVinci Reacts. Today I'm going to be getting into another history-related video. This video was made by Weird History. I will have a link for their channel at the end of this video. The last 30 seconds, you should see an icon pop up somewhere within the video. You can click on it. It'll take you to their channel. You can watch the video, subscribe, like all the other good stuff. And I will have a link for this original video in the description box down below if you want to watch it without me possibly pausing and talking over it, or if you want to do a reaction to it yourself because you happen to be a reactor or whatever else. That is the link that you will use to go ahead and get to the original video. Now, with that being said, this video is called "What Actually Happened When the Slaves Were Freed." I'm 99% sure it's talking about in the United States. The thing about when the slaves were freed, it depends on what you're talking about. Are you talking about when the Emancipation Proclamation was made, in which case that was only referring to Confederate states, not states that still were part of the Union that had slavery? They were still allowed to have slaves as far as the Emancipation Proclamation was concerned. It wasn't until, I believe, the 13th Amendment that really killed slavery for the most part. Because there were still some loopholes, like if somebody was a prisoner, they could still technically be a slave. Around that time, when the 13th Amendment was ratified, I believe that there was a really prosperous period for black people. There were some black senators and Congress people. There was a lot of stuff that was going on that was beneficial to black people. But then I believe Andrew Johnson put really messed up the progress for black people in America, and I think it was either him or someone after him that ended up stopping the Reconstruction period at the time, and pretty much allowed the southern states to govern themselves again. And once that happened, that's when the Jim Crow laws and stuff start coming in, and the rights of black people were pretty much taken away or put on into a second-class citizenship place. And that wasn't corrected, obviously, until the 1960s. So, yeah, who knows what would have... that's an alternative history I would like to see. What would have happened if the Reconstruction period had not been prematurely ended? What would America be like if the Reconstruction hadn't ended? I would imagine it would probably be like the UK. Because in the UK, they obviously had slavery, but when it ended, I'm pretty sure it was definitely racism and everything else. Hell, there's still racism over there probably, but it's obviously nowhere near as much as America. But that's the thing. It wouldn't be as much. There'd still be sects of racism throughout the country in small pockets or whatever, but as far as the systematic stuff and everything, I think that would have been really, I'm sure there would have been something still there, but it would have been nowhere near as much as what we have today. That's just an interesting thought. I'd like to see if there is a video related to that, but anyway, let's jump into this and see what it has to offer.
American school children are taught that slaves in Confederate states were freed when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. While true, the reality of actually freeing those slaves was far more complicated. Today, we're going to take a look at what actually happened on plantations when the slaves were freed. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, please leave a comment and let us know what other topics you would like to hear about. Okay, so let's head back to the days after the Civil War.
Some emancipated slaves decided to remain on plantations.
You would think that once freed, the slaves would get off the plantations as fast as humanly possible. But in his autobiography, Booker T. Washington mentioned that many ex-slaves, especially older ones, decided to stay.
Yeah, that's true. Because when you think about it, when slaves got freed, they didn't get anything. There was supposed to be a promise of 40 acres and a mule to help them get their lives started, but obviously the government reneged on that promise, So a lot of slaves they had literally nothing, like no education, no skills outside of working on a plantation. Uh, Still a lot of racism, so they didn't really have the opportunity to get jobs in other areas, really. So a lot of them ended up going back to the plantation and working as sharecroppers, which pretty much kept them in like infinite debt. So they were just constantly working on this plantation to pay off debt to the landowner, only to get further and further in debt because the amount that they were supposed to pay off was almost impossible with the amount of crops that they were selling. It's like there's no way they were going to be able to pay that debt off, so it just kept getting added to the next month's debt or whatever, and just kept building up. So yeah, it was like there was really nothing they could really do. So a lot of people probably just stayed on the plantation just to be sure that they had a place to stay.
Although free, these ex-slaves typically made deals with their former masters to work for pay. According to Washington, one by one, the older slaves began to wander from the slave quarters back to the big house to have a whispered conversation with their former owners as to the future. Thomas Rutling was only 9 when he and his fellow slaves learned of their emancipation. He thought freedom would mean his family would now live a life like their former master, but instead, the family chose to stay on the plantation another 2 years. Rutledge, along with his brother and sister, finally left the plantation in 1865. They went to live with a family in Nashville. He later attended the Fisk Free Colored School, which eventually became Fisk University. In her 1909 book, Memories of Childhood Slavery Days, ex-slave Annie L. Burton wrote of her own experiences with emancipation. Annie recalled that when the news reached the Alabama plantation she worked on, every slave who wasn't feeble or sickly left immediately. Some of these younger, healthier ex-slaves even immediately joined the Union Army. However, because their mother had run away, Annie and her younger sisters stayed behind under the care of their mistress. This may not have been the act of charity it appears to be. This same mistress tried to talk her husband into not telling the slaves about their freedom, and then made the feeble and sickly slaves who remained on the plantation work the fields. After the crops were planted, some plantation owners asked their ex-slaves to sign contracts guaranteeing they would work the crops until January. They would then be divided at the fall harvest for payment. Such a deal is mentioned in the Reverend Irving E. Lowry's 1911 book, Life on the Old Plantation in Antebellum Days, or A Story Based on Facts. Lowry said his ex-master tried to convince the slaves to sign the deals by making a long speech in which he reminded them that he wasn't a bad guy. The plantation owner pointed out that he never put an overseer over them, never employed bloodhounds, and never separated a mother from her child, nor a husband from his wife. He also told them that they were welcome to stay on his plantation as long as they'd like, and that any mistreatment they had experienced off the plantation was their own fault and not his. Although that argument might sound meager to us, all but one ex-slave signed the contract.
Yeah, at the time, I'm sure that would sound like a good deal to a person that was just enslaved. But yeah, looking back on it now, you realize like you ain't doing no favor for us. Oh man, one former slave owner let the whole plantation get drunk and party. Okay.
Charles Hayes owned a plantation 16 miles north of Louisville, Kentucky. Like many slave owners, Hayes at first chose not to tell his slaves about emancipation at all. However, after a few days, he relented out of fear of being arrested. According to ex-slave Harry Smith in his 1891 book, 50 Years of Slavery in the United States of America, Hayes broke the news by saying, "I am about to tell you something I never expected to be obliged to tell you in my life. It is this. One and all, women, men, and children, belonging to me, you are free to go where you please." Smith also noted that at the same time, Hayes was cursing Lincoln's name and exclaiming that if Lincoln were there, he'd kill him for taking his slaves away. However, after Hayes cooled down, he gave the entire plantation access to his whiskey stash and threw what sounds like a pretty decent party. It was described as a great jubilee in which the ex-master and all the ex-slaves got drunk together. Smith recalls that everyone was cheering Abraham Lincoln, but Hayes was way too drunk to notice. By nightfall, the revelers had broken into song and dance and kept it up until morning.
I'd like to hear the rest of that story because I'm pretty sure it doesn't end there. I want to know what happens when the master guy sobered up. But I mean, that was relatively progressive for at the time, I guess. The idea of partying and like hanging out and stuff, pretty much mixing like that. That's probably something that anybody else would have killed over. Um, yeah, it is interesting getting these types of stories.
According to the Civil War diary of James T. Ayers, Charles Hayes was far from being the only master who tried to hide the news of emancipation from his slaves. Ayers was a Union recruiter who went into the South to enlist newly freed men into the Union Army. Things being as they were, he also often found himself as the person to inform the ex-slaves that they were, in fact, now free. In his diary entry for May 7, 1864, Ayers recorded spreading the word about emancipation to a group of 4 ex-slaves on a plantation near Huntsville, Alabama. He accomplished this by showing them a broadside that featured an illustration of freed slaves on one side and a 2-sentence version of the Emancipation Proclamation on the other. Ayers states the 4 men agreed to enlist, so he told them to gather their things, and he promised he would protect them. When they were confronted by their ex-master, Ayers drew his revolver, and sounding much like a hero in an action movie, calmly told the man, "I shall not hurt a hair of your head, sir, if you be quiet, but I have come for your slaves, and your slaves I'll have." It is believed that Ayers recruited hundreds of black soldiers to the Union cause and spread the word of emancipation to thousands before his death in September of 1865.
Somebody in my comment section did mention something about towards the end of the Civil War, there were more black soldiers in the Union Army than there were soldiers in general in the Southern Army or the Confederate Army. Is that true?
According to his 1901 autobiography, Up from Slavery, the first day of freedom at the Virginia plantation where Booker T. Washington was born started with a simple, solemn meeting. The meeting was then followed by a reading of the Emancipation Proclamation by a government official, and the news was initially quite well received by the now former slaves. Washington recalled that the master's entire family had gathered on the veranda of the house. He got the impression that they were sad, not because of the loss of property, but rather because they were, in many ways, very close to some of the ex-slaves, who would now be leaving. He recalled his mother kissing her children while tears of joy ran down her cheeks. According to Washington, for some minutes there was great rejoicing and thanksgiving and wild scenes of ecstasy, but there was no feeling of bitterness. In fact, there was pity among the slaves for our former owners. Once the initial joy passed, however, many of the ex-slaves began to feel anxiety over what freedom would really mean. Washington observed, "The great responsibility of being free, of having charge of themselves, of having to think and plan for themselves and their children, seemed to take possession of them." He noted that some of the slaves were 70 or 80 years old and had no strength with which to earn a living. According to 1908's generously titled Memoirs of Samuel Spotswood Clement relating interesting experiences in days of slavery and freedom, Clement's ex-master, Tasswood Ward, informed him and the other slaves on Ward's plantation of their freedom by reading to them from the newspaper. Spotswood recalled that when Mr. and Mrs. Ward came out of the house, he was holding a newspaper and she was crying. They walked to the front of the steps and he said, "Men and women, you are as free as the birds that fly in the air." Ward then raised the paper and read from it. He informed the ex-slaves that Lee had surrendered to Grant and the Southern Confederacy was at an end. He then offered to pay the men to stay and help reap the crops. The offer was accepted by all but one man. Known only as Uncle Fendel, the man was concerned that the rebels might pick up the fight again and revoke their freedom. There's somebody who's been around the block once or twice.
I mean, I would imagine how scary that situation would be, given the fact that, like, even though the war ends, you know there are, like, going to be small rebel groups going around. And, you know, if there's not anybody there to protect you from leaving, then what's stopping some random mob of sympathizers from just going around and like trying to hurt the slaves or whatever else. So I can understand why they would, why some slaves would choose to do that.
Thomas Almond Ashby was 17 years old when he watched his father inform the family slaves on their Front Royal, Virginia plantation that they were all now free. In his 1914 memoir, The Valley Campaigns, Ashby recalled that his father told the ex-slaves that he had no further control over them, and that in the future he would pay them for their services based on wage rates established by the community. He told them that if they wished to stay in his employ, they could do so as long as they desired, but that if any of them wished to seek out a new home, he wouldn't try to stop them from making a change. The elder Ashby further assured the now freed people that he had nothing but a friendly desire to see them do well and be happy. He also warned them of the altered conditions that freedom would bring, and he urged them to cultivate habits of thrift and industry. He believed hard work would make them useful citizens and earn them self-respect, which is some pretty ironic advice coming from a slave owner. According to Ashby, it took several years before all of the ex-slaves had finally left the plantation. One, a woman known only as Aunt Susan, seemed to take Ashby's advice about thrift to heart. After saving up 3 years' worth of money she earned taking in the wash and doing light work, she was actually able to buy a neat little house in the city.
There you go. Juneteenth commemorates the end of slavery. So, yes. For those of you that don't know, I believe Juneteenth was the day that either Texas finally gave up and officially freed their slaves, or it was the day when I believe like some Union group of soldiers came and forced the slave owners in Texas to free their slaves. Either way, it has to do with Texas freeing their slaves at the time. And as much as Donald Trump wants people to believe, we have known about Juneteenth a lot way before he brought it up. This has been a thing for a while now. The first time I ever heard of Juneteenth was, I want to say I was in high school. So that was probably like the mid 2000s. Yeah, Juneteenth has been a thing for a while, and that's when I learned about it. I know it's been going on even longer than that.
Juneteenth, also known as Emancipation Day or Freedom Day, is an official holiday in the state of Texas and an unofficial American holiday that commemorates June 19, 1865. On that date, Union General Gordon Granger read from the federal proclamation that slavery was over in the state of Texas. While the Emancipation Proclamation had ended slavery in the Confederacy more than 2 years earlier, it took some time for the news to reach all parts of the war-torn states. Granger's proclamation guaranteed absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. It also declared that the connection between master and slave was officially replaced by that between employer and hired labor. During the late 19th century, Juneteenth was primarily celebrated by the black community. However, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s led to a renewed interest in the holiday at a wider level. In January of 1980, it became an official holiday in the state of Texas. And in the 21st century, it has become a widely recognized day to celebrate black historical achievements and encourage respect and pride in all cultures. So what do you think? How fast or slow do you think that change was? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.
Time out, hold up. This guy's name is Cassius Clay. Maybe I shouldn't speculate too much. I'll say, is he connected in some way to Muhammad Ali's family? That's what I want to know. But, yeah, like, one of the reasons why I like doing reactions to videos like this is because not only do I learn new stuff about black history in America and things like that, but it also gives people that might not have ever heard of this or studied it or whatever a chance to learn about it. One of the reasons why Black History Month is so important is because in America we don't really study a lot of black history. Like, there's a lot of figures and events that get, I don't want to say like intentionally forgotten or not taught, but they tend to get like pushed into the background for other things. And they never really get a chance to like go back and look at them unless you decide to seek it out yourself. Like if you go take a African Americans class, or if you study it yourself from a book or whatever else, internet now, you'll probably never learn about it. Like it amazes me how many people didn't know about some of the events that I already done reactions to, like the riots in Tulsa, the massacre in Rosewood. There was also an event that happened in North Carolina. I believe it was North Carolina. And that event was crazy because, well, recently we had the situation with the Capitol, U.S. Capitol, where a bunch of like right-wing Trump supporters raided the Capitol in order to, you know, overturn the election results. And there was an event that happened in North Carolina where a mob of angry whites literally did go in and force the governor to do something, and I believe they actually overthrew that governor. Like they kicked him out and burned down his house and everything. Like it was related to I forgot the story. I don't want to say misinformation, so I'm gonna say what I think it was, but just know this is just what I think it was. I still have to research and make sure, but I think it was about a situation with a prisoner that was accused of raping somebody, and you know the story about how they're in prison and they haven't gone to trial yet, but a mob forms and they are looking to lynch the person before the trial or whatever starts. And I guess they were upset that the governor wouldn't let them like get into the prison somehow, so they just went to the governor and just took over. I could be wrong about that, but it was something race related. But anyway, yeah, just go look up race riots in America, and it'll pop up somewhere in there, North Carolina. But yeah, it's some interesting stuff. Now, I would like to learn more about this Cassius Clay person, because I have a strong feeling they're connected to Muhammad Ali in some way. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and share. Leave in the comment section any information that you might have not known. Like maybe something in this video that is new to you, and so you just want to acknowledge, like, hey, I learned about this. Or if there's something in this video you feel was overlooked and you want to give some more information on, feel free to go in the comment section and leave that information there. I know the Civil War era is rather big on YouTube because of, well, really just a lot of information that isn't really known, and a lot of stuff that tend to have gotten forgotten. So people really get interested in it. So I would like to see what people have to say about it, and you know, check it out and everything else. But anyway, I'm Devon DaVinci. Hopefully you've been enlightened. I look forward to seeing you guys on a future video. And until then, I'm gonna give you the deuces, and I'm signing out. Deuces.